Philip Corral raised his champagne flute high above the crowd, his laugh echoing across the crystal chandeliers of the plaza's private ballroom. "To new beginnings," he bellowed, pulling Elizabeth, his stunning socialite wife, closer to his side. She sparkled like a diamond under the lights, her silver gown catching every eye in the room. "Some women," Philip announced to the watching crowd, "are meant to stay in the background. Support staff, not partners." He kissed Elizabeth's temple as she flaunted the 10-carat ring he'd given her just weeks after the divorce petition was filed. "But Elizabeth? She's the real deal. She understands what it takes to win." The room erupted in polite applause and knowing chuckles. Lawyers, investors, and Manhattan's elite clinked their glasses in agreement. At a table near the back, barely visible beneath the shadow of a marble column, Catherine Corral sat alone. Her cream dress was simple, understated, bought 3 years ago when she still believed marriage meant forever. Her hand rested on a pen. Before her, divorce papers that would erase 12 years of her life in a single signature. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't even look up when Philip's laughter grew louder. Because in her purse, beneath the compact mirror and house keys she'd soon have to return, sat a sealed envelope from Chicago. A law firm she'd never heard of. A name she didn't recognize. A letter she hadn't yet opened. Philip thought he'd discarded her. He had no idea she was about to inherit an empire, and that his entire world was about to collapse beneath him. The Plaza Hotel's crystal ballroom was not designed for intimacy. It was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, where the late autumn light cast everything in shades of gold and gray. The room itself was draped in ivory silk, chandeliers dripping with enough crystal to fund a small country's GDP. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a performance. And Philip Corral had choreographed every moment. Catherine adjusted the strap of her dress and kept her eyes on the papers in front of her. The room hummed with conversation. Investors discussing market trends, lawyers exchanging business cards, a waiter refilling champagne flutes that cost more than Catherine's monthly rent. She was invisible here. That was the point. Across the room, Elizabeth posed for a photographer Philip had hired to document the occasion. Her dress shimmered like liquid silver, cut low enough to command attention, fitted perfectly to a body that had never known the exhaustion of working 2 jobs while a husband chased a dream. She laughed at something Philip whispered in her ear, then turned to flash her engagement ring at the camera. "Gorgeous, isn't she?" Philip's lawyer, Martin Gaines, appeared at Catherine's side, setting down a folder thick enough to double as a weapon. He didn't wait for an answer. "Mr. Corral is offering you a very generous settlement, Mrs. Corral. $10,000, plus the contents of your personal checking account. No alimony. Clean break." Catherine looked up at him. Martin was in his 50s, silver-haired, expensive. The kind of lawyer who'd never had to choose between groceries and electricity. $10,000, she repeated quietly. "Given the terms of your prenuptial agreement, Mr. Corral is under no legal obligation to offer you anything," Martin continued, flipping through the document with practiced efficiency. "But he's a generous man. He wants you to be able to start fresh." Fresh. Catherine almost laughed. She'd spent 12 years building Philip's career from nothing. She'd worked as a receptionist at a law firm while he finished his MBA. She'd edited every pitch deck, every investor email, every presentation that eventually made him one of New York's most successful real estate developers. She'd believed him when he said they were partners. And now, in this ballroom full of people who looked at her like furniture, Philip was offering her $10,000 and calling it generosity. "Where do I sign?" Catherine asked. Martin blinked, surprised by her lack of resistance. He pointed to the highlighted sections and Catherine picked up the pen. She signed her name 3 times. Clean, steady strokes. No hesitation. "That's it?" Martin asked, clearly expecting a fight. "That's it," Catherine said. She stood, leaving the papers on the table. As she turned toward the exit, she heard Philip's voice ring out again, louder this time, drunk on victory. "Catherine," he called. The room went quiet. Every head turned. She stopped but didn't look back. "No hard feelings, right?" Philip said, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "You're free now. Free to find someone more? Your speed." Elizabeth giggled. Someone else laughed. The sound rippled through the room like a wave. Catherine's hand tightened around the strap of her purse. The purse that held the sealed envelope she still hadn't opened. The envelope that had arrived the night before, delivered by courier, marked urgent and confidential. She didn't respond. She simply walked toward the heavy oak doors, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. Behind her, Philip raised his glass one more time. To the future. The crowd cheered. And Catherine Corral disappeared into the hallway, unnoticed and unremarkable. Exactly the way Philip wanted it. The plaza's hallway was cooler than the ballroom, quieter. Catherine leaned against the marble wall and closed her eyes, letting the silence settle over her like a blanket. It was done. 12 years erased in 3 signatures. She reached into her purse and pulled out the envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, expensive paper. The return address was embossed in gold. Harrington and Stroud, estate attorneys, Chicago, Illinois. She'd never heard of them. The letter had arrived at her apartment last night, delivered by a man in a suit who'd asked her to sign for it personally. She'd been too exhausted to open it, too focused on preparing herself for today's humiliation. But now, standing alone in the plaza's gilded hallway while Philip celebrated with his new wife, Catherine broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead and a business card. The letter was brief. "Ms. Catherine Corral. We represent the estate of Eleanor Harrington Beaumont, deceased. We have been attempting to locate you for several months regarding a matter of significant legal and financial importance. It is imperative that we speak with you immediately. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience. Time is of the essence. Respectfully, Jonathan Harrington, Senior Partner." Catherine stared at the letter, her mind racing. Eleanor Harrington Beaumont. The name meant nothing to her. She didn't know anyone in Chicago. She didn't know anyone with money. Her mother had died when she was 19. A nurse in Ohio who'd worked double shifts her entire life and left behind nothing but medical debt. And yet, the letter was real. The law firm was real. The urgency in the language was real. Catherine's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Ms. Corral, this is Jonathan Harrington. We've been trying to reach you. Please call immediately. This concerns your inheritance." Inheritance. The word sat heavy in her mind, impossible and surreal. Catherine glanced back toward the ballroom doors. Inside, Philip was probably toasting to his freedom. Elizabeth was probably planning the wedding. The lawyers were probably congratulating themselves on a clean, easy divorce. None of them knew. Catherine slipped the letter back into her purse and walked toward the plaza's exit, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Whatever was waiting for her in Chicago, it was about to change everything. Catherine's apartment in Queens looked smaller than she remembered. The taxi ride from Manhattan had taken 40 minutes through evening traffic, and by the time she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her studio, exhaustion had settled into her bones. She dropped her purse on the second-hand coffee table and stared at the space that had been hers for the last 6 months, since Philip had asked her to leave the penthouse they'd shared. 400 square feet. A kitchenette with a temperamental stove. A window that overlooked a laundromat. This was what freedom looked like. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out the letter again, reading it twice more before her phone rang. Unknown number. Chicago area code. Catherine answered. "Ms. Corral." The voice was smooth, authoritative, aged with experience. "This is Jonathan Harrington. Thank you for taking my call. I apologize for the urgency, but I need to speak with you about your inheritance immediately." "I don't understand," Catherine said quietly. "The letter mentioned Eleanor Harrington Beaumont. I don't know who that is." There was a pause. Then Jonathan spoke, his tone careful, deliberate. "Ms. Corral, Eleanor Beaumont was your grandmother. Your mother's mother." My mother's mother was a nurse in Ohio. She died when I was 5. That was your maternal grandmother, yes, Jonathan said. But your mother, Catherine, was adopted as an infant. Her biological mother was Eleanor Beaumont, daughter of the Harrington family, one of the most powerful legacy families in American history. Catherine's hand tightened around the phone. That's impossible. I assure you it's not. Eleanor gave birth in 1961 under private circumstances. The child, your mother, was placed for adoption to protect the family's reputation and ensure the child's safety. Eleanor never stopped searching for her. When she passed away 6 months ago, her estate retained us to locate her sole living descendant. Me, Catherine whispered. Yes. Ms. Corral, the Harrington estate includes controlling interests in shipping logistics, infrastructure development, and a diversified private equity portfolio spanning 5 decades. The trust is irrevocable, protected, and was deliberately concealed to preserve your mother's anonymity. Catherine felt the room tilt. How much? Jonathan's voice remained steady. Liquid assets total approximately $3.6 billion. Real estate, business holdings, and trust instruments bring the full value closer to $4.8 billion. The number didn't feel real. It felt like a word in a foreign language. And my ex-husband? The trust is explicitly excluded from marital property in all jurisdictions. Your divorce settlement stands as signed. Mr. Corral has no claim. Catherine exhaled slowly, her mind struggling to reconcile the woman sitting in a studio apartment with the woman Jonathan Harrington was describing. What happens next? She asked. A jet is waiting for you at Teterboro, Jonathan said. We need you in Chicago tonight. There are documents to sign, assets to transfer, and decisions only you can make. Catherine stood and walked to the bathroom mirror. She looked the same, tired eyes, simple dress, hair pulled back in a clip. But somewhere beneath the surface, something had shifted. She was still Catherine Corral. She was just no longer ordinary. I'll be there, she said. The rumors started in the back rooms of Manhattan investment firms, whispered over martinis at private clubs, traded like currency between men who measured worth in zeros. Catherine Corral. Harrington legacy. Billions. Philip heard it first from Marcus Wendell, a hedge fund manager he'd been courting for months. They were at Cipriani, discussing a potential Dallas development, when Marcus leaned forward and asked casually, "Isn't your ex-wife the Harrington heir?" Philip's fork stopped midway to his mouth. What? Catherine Corral. Chicago estate lawyers confirmed it yesterday. Shipping empire, infrastructure holdings, she's worth north of $4 billion. Marcus chuckled. Hell of a settlement you gave her. 10,000, wasn't it? Philip didn't remember the rest of lunch. By the time he returned to his office, his assistant had fielded 6 calls from lawyers, investors, and reporters asking for comment. Elizabeth was sitting on his desk, scrolling through her phone, her expression tight. People are saying you divorced a billionaire, she said without looking up. Philip grabbed his phone and dialed Martin Gaines. The divorce isn't filed yet, he said the moment Martin answered. We can stop this. Philip. I don't care what it costs. File a motion. Emotional duress. Procedural error. Anything. The papers are signed and witnessed. It's done. Then undone it. There was silence on the other end. Then Martin spoke quietly. She's retained Keller and Associates. They've already sent notice that any further contact constitutes harassment. Philip's hand trembled. I need to see her. Philip. He hung up. Catherine agreed to meet him once. Not at his office. Not at a restaurant he chose. At a coffee shop in Midtown, neutral ground, 2 o'clock on a Wednesday. Philip arrived early, rehearsing what he'd say. When Catherine walked in, dressed simply in black, no jewelry, no fanfare, he stood too quickly, knocking his chair back. Catherine. Thank you for coming. You have 10 minutes, she said, sitting across from him. Her voice was polite, distant. I made a mistake, Philip began, leaning forward. I was under pressure. The business, the investors. I wasn't thinking clearly. We built everything together, Catherine. I can't just walk away from that. You already did. I'm asking for another chance. Catherine's expression didn't change. The divorce is final, Philip. My attorneys have made that clear. But the trust, surely there's a way we can. No. The word was final. Absolute. Philip felt panic claw at his throat. Catherine, please. Don't do this. She stood. Goodbye, Philip. She walked out, and Philip sat frozen, watching her disappear into the Manhattan afternoon. Unreachable. Untouchable. Gone. Catherine spent 3 months learning how power actually worked. Not the performance of it. The champagne toasts, the magazine covers, the public declarations Philip had always craved. The mechanics. The silent architecture that moved billions without fanfare. She sat in boardrooms in Chicago, San Francisco, and New York. She studied cap tables, voting rights, and debt structures. She learned that control didn't require majority ownership, just strategic positioning. And she learned that the men who truly held power rarely announced it. Jonathan Harrington introduced her to advisors who spoke in percentages and probabilities, not promises. By January, Catherine had restructured her portfolio. By March, she'd made her first acquisition. A private equity firm called Meridian Capital. Small, discreet, based in Delaware. Meridian held senior debt in 2 real estate developments. A luxury condo tower in Miami and a mixed-use complex in Dallas. Both projects belonged to Philip Corral. Philip never noticed. The paperwork was buried in layers of holding companies, the transaction processed through intermediaries. As far as he knew, his financing was secure. Until the invitation arrived. The Children's Hospital Foundation Gala was one of Los Angeles's most exclusive charity events. Black tie, 5-figure tables. A guest list that read like a Fortune 500 directory. Philip attended every year. This year, he'd purchased a table for 12, positioning himself beside tech executives and venture capitalists he'd been courting for months. Elizabeth wore emerald green, her smile wide as cameras flashed. Catherine arrived alone. She wore midnight blue, elegant, understated, tailored perfectly. Her hair was pulled back, diamond studs her only jewelry. She didn't pose for photographers. She didn't need to. The room noticed anyway. Philip saw her halfway through the cocktail hour. He froze, champagne glass suspended, watching as she moved through the crowd with quiet confidence. Investors greeted her warmly. She smiled, shook hands, spoke briefly, then moved on. She didn't look at Philip once. Dinner was served. Speeches were made. And then during dessert, Philip's phone buzzed. A text from his CFO, urgent. Call immediately. Philip excused himself and stepped into the hallway. Meridian Capital just called the Miami loan. His CFO said without preamble. Effective immediately. Full repayment required in 30 days, or they seize the asset. Philip's blood went cold. That's impossible. We have 2 years left on that note. There's an acceleration clause. They're invoking it. And Philip, Dallas just received the same notice. Who owns Meridian? There was a pause. A holding company. Cascade Holdings. The beneficial owner is listed as Catherine Corral. The phone slipped from Philip's hand. When he returned to the ballroom, Catherine was standing near the exit, speaking quietly with a gray-haired man Philip recognized, David Chun, chairman of one of the largest pension funds in California. She glanced up, met Philip's eyes across the room, and smiled. Not triumphant. Just knowing. Then she turned and walked out. Philip sank into his chair. Across the table, Elizabeth's smile had frozen, her champagne glass trembling slightly in her hand. She just realized what Philip had already lost. Philip found him in a lawyer's office in Boston. A man with Catherine's eyes and none of her composure. Richard Harrington was 53, twice divorced and bitter. He'd been cut from the family trust 20 years earlier after a series of failed investments and a public scandal involving embezzled funds. When Eleanor Beaumont died, Richard had expected reinstatement. Instead, everything went to a granddaughter he'd never met. She stole what's mine, Richard said, leaning across the scarred conference table. Eleanor was senile at the end. Manipulated. That trust should have been contested the moment she died. Philip listened, calculating. What if we contest it now? Richard's attorney, a disbarred litigator named Paul Vickers who still practiced in gray legal areas, smiled slowly. On what grounds? Fraud, Philip said. Catherine knew about her lineage during our marriage. She hid it deliberately to protect the assets during the divorce. Can you prove that? Vickers asked. Philip met Richard's eyes. I can testify to it. Under oath? Yes. Richard grinned. Then we have a case. The filing hit federal court 3 weeks later. Harrington versus Corral alleged fraudulent concealment, claiming Catherine had knowingly hidden her inheritance to circumvent marital asset division. Richard's petition sought to nullify the trust distribution pending investigation. Philip's affidavit was 8 pages long, describing private conversations that never happened, emails that didn't exist, and a conspiracy he'd invented over scotch in Richard's hotel room. The media devoured it. Billionaire heiress accused of hiding fortune from ex-husband. Real estate mogul claims betrayal in divorce settlement. Family insider, she knew everything. Philip gave interviews, his performance flawless, wounded, betrayed, a victim of calculated deception. Elizabeth stood beside him, playing the supportive wife, though her smile had grown thinner with each appearance. Catherine said nothing publicly. She met with her legal team daily. Keller and Associates had brought in federal litigators and forensic accountants. Jonathan Harrington flew in from Chicago. They built their defense in silence, methodically, without theatrics. But the damage was spreading. Investors grew cautious. Business partners requested meetings. Whispers circulated that perhaps Philip had been wronged after all. And then on a gray morning in April, the order came through. Temporary injunction granted. Trust assets frozen pending evidentiary hearing. Catherine's accounts locked at 9:47 a.m. Her access to properties suspended by noon. By evening, federal marshals had placed holds on her real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and corporate interests. Philip celebrated with Richard at a steakhouse in Midtown. Their glasses raised, their laughter loud enough to draw stares. To justice, Richard said. To taking back what's ours, Philip replied. Neither man noticed the woman in the corner booth, quietly photographing them both. One of Catherine's investigators, documenting everything. The estate in Lake Forest, Illinois, looked like something from a dream Catherine had never dared to have. Stone and glass, surrounded by ancient oaks. Gates that opened to a circular drive where snow had begun to fall in heavy, silent curtains. She'd stayed here twice, brief visits while lawyers processed paperwork and accountants cataloged assets. Now the gates were locked. Federal notice plastered across the entrance. Property under court seal. No entry by order of U.S. District Court. Catherine stood on the sidewalk, suitcase at her feet, snowflakes catching in her hair. Her credit cards had been declined that morning. Her bank accounts showed zero balances. The hotels where she'd been staying had politely asked her to settle her bill or vacate. She had $340 in cash. A winter coat. And nowhere to go. It felt terrifyingly like the divorce all over again. Standing in Philip's shadow, stripped of everything, dismissed as irrelevant. Except this time, there was no ballroom full of witnesses. No champagne laughter. Just Catherine, alone in the cold, watching snow bury the estate that should have been hers. Who are you without the money? The question sat heavy in her chest. She'd spent 3 months learning power. How to move it, shape it, wield it. But power built on assets could be frozen with a single court order. What remained when everything external was taken away? Catherine closed her eyes and thought of her mother. Catherine, the nurse who'd worked double shifts, who'd raised a daughter alone, who'd never mentioned wealthy relatives or hidden legacies. Who'd been strong not because of what she had, but because of who she was. Catherine opened her suitcase, searching for her mother's photo, the only personal item she'd kept close. Behind the frame, tucked into the felt backing, was a folded piece of paper she'd never noticed before. Yellowed, brittle, dated 3 months before her mother died. A handwritten note with an address. Federal Archive, Alexandria, Virginia, Box 1847. Use my maiden name. Beneath it, in her mother's careful script. When you need the truth, you'll know where to find it. Catherine stared at the note as snow gathered on her shoulders. She'd been looking for weapons in boardrooms and bank accounts. Her mother had left her something far more powerful. Proof. The National Archives facility in Alexandria was a fortress of bureaucracy. Concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, rows of filing cabinets that stretched like catacombs into artificial darkness. Catherine stood at the intake desk with her mother's maiden name written on a request form. Catherine Marie Beaumont. The archivist, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, typed slowly into an ancient computer system. Box 1847. Sealed documents. Filed in 1994. She looked up. You'll need identification proving relation to the depositor. Catherine handed over her birth certificate, her mother's death certificate, and a notarized letter from Jonathan Harrington. 30 minutes later, she sat in a sterile viewing room with a single archive box on the table before her. Inside, a sealed envelope marked confidential, Eleanor Harrington Beaumont. Catherine's hands trembled as she broke the seal. The affidavit was 12 pages, notarized in Chicago on August 14, 1994. Eleanor Beaumont's signature at the bottom, witnessed by 2 attorneys and a federal notary. It detailed everything. The private adoption in 1961. The payments made to ensure Catherine's safety and anonymity. The irrevocable trust established to protect a bloodline Eleanor had been forced to hide. DNA samples stored in a federal lab under seal, preserved for future verification. And a single line underscored twice. Should my granddaughter ever be challenged, this document serves as absolute proof of lineage and intent. Eleanor had known. She'd prepared for exactly this moment. Catherine called Jonathan from the archive parking lot. I found it, she said. Within 48 hours, her legal team had filed an emergency motion. DNA tests were ordered, comparing Catherine's samples to Eleanor's preserved records. The results came back in 72 hours. 99.97% probability of direct lineage. Keller and Associates submitted the affidavit, the DNA evidence, and a 14-page brief dismantling every claim Philip and Richard had made. The federal judge scheduled an evidentiary hearing. 2 weeks. Chicago District Court. Philip heard the news from Paul Vickers, who'd grown noticeably quieter since the DNA results surfaced. They have an affidavit, Vickers said carefully. From 1994. Notarized, sealed, stored federally. Philip waved him off. Doesn't matter. It testified under what? She still hid it during the marriage. Philip, the document proves she didn't know. I don't care what it proves. We're too far into back out now. Richard agreed, fueled by desperation and decades of resentment. Neither man noticed the walls closing in. Catherine, sitting in her attorney's Chicago office, reviewed the trial strategy one final time. Calm. Methodical. Certain. She'd been stripped of everything twice now. This time, she'd built her defense on something Philip could never touch. The truth. The Dirksen Federal Building courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters lined the back wall. Investors filled the gallery. Elizabeth sat 3 rows behind Philip, her expression carefully neutral, her hands folded in her lap like a woman waiting for a verdict she already knew. Judge Margaret Fowler presided. 62, sharp-eyed, a former prosecutor with no patience for theatrics. Philip took the stand first, his suit immaculate, his posture confident. Mr. Corral, his attorney began. Did your ex-wife ever discuss her family's wealth during your marriage? Yes, Philip said smoothly. Multiple times. She knew about the Harrington connection. She told me she was protecting the assets until after the divorce. And you have proof of these conversations? They were private. Between husband and wife. Catherine's attorney, Diane Keller, rose for cross-examination. She was 50, steel-haired, and known for dismantling witnesses with surgical precision. Mr. Corral, you claim Mrs. Corral discussed her inheritance with you during the marriage. Can you provide a single email, text message, or recorded conversation confirming this? Philip hesitated. As I said, they were private. Yes or no, Mr. Corral? No. Can you name a single witness who heard these alleged conversations? No, but you testified that Mrs. Corral mentioned the Harrington family by name. Yet in your own divorce deposition 6 months ago, you stated, and I quote, Catherine has no family wealth or inheritance to declare. Is that correct? Philip's jaw tightened. I was mistaken. Or you were truthful then and lying now? Objection. Vickers called weakly. Overruled, Judge Fowler said. Answer the question, Mr. Corral. Philip's silence filled the courtroom. Diane placed a document on the screen. Eleanor's 1994 affidavit. This affidavit, filed 28 years before Mrs. Corral learned of her inheritance, explicitly states that the Harrington lineage was concealed from all descendants to protect their safety and anonymity. The DNA evidence confirms Mrs. Corral's bloodline conclusively. Yet you claim she somehow knew, and conspired to hide information that was legally sealed until her grandmother's death. Philip said nothing. Mr. Corral, did you fabricate your testimony to overturn a divorce settlement you now regret? No. Did you commit perjury in federal court? Richard Harrington stood abruptly from the plaintiff's table. Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw from this action. The courtroom erupted. Judge Fowler's gavel cracked like thunder. Richard's attorney scrambled to file the motion. Paul Vickers stared at Philip in horror. Judge Fowler's voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Corral, I'm referring your testimony to the U.S. Attorney for perjury investigation. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Philip sat frozen. In the gallery, Elizabeth stood quietly and walked out, her heels echoing in the sudden silence. She never looked back. Philip's investment firm collapsed in stages. First, the indictment, federal perjury charges that made headlines for a week. Then the clients, fleeing in quiet succession, unwilling to associate with a man whose lies had been dissected in open court. Finally, the creditors, circling like wolves when the Miami and Dallas projects defaulted simultaneously. Caldwell Investment Group was worth $47 million at its peak. By August, it was worth nothing. The acquisition happened through a shell company called Foundry Holdings. The paperwork was clean, processed through intermediaries, finalized on a Tuesday morning without fanfare. Philip didn't learn who owned Foundry until the liquidation notice arrived. Catherine Corral had purchased his firm for $200,000, the value of its remaining assets after debt. She dismantled it in 6 weeks. She visited him once more. Not in his office, he'd lost that. Not in his penthouse, the bank had seized it. In the lobby of a midtown hotel where Philip was staying temporarily, his belongings packed in boxes stacked against the wall. He looked smaller somehow, hollowed out. The confidence that had defined him replaced by something exhausted and bitter. Catherine, he said, standing when she approached. His voice was cautious, wary. She didn't sit. She stood before him, composed, dressed simply in black, her presence filling the space between them. I came to tell you something, she said quietly. Philip waited. The financial models you built your reputation on, the portfolio strategies, the risk assessments, the projection algorithms. I wrote those. Every single one. While you were networking and closing deals, I was running the numbers in our apartment at 2 a.m. Philip's face went pale. You replaced me because you thought I was ordinary, Catherine continued, her voice steady, final. You never realized I was the foundation. She turned to leave. Catherine, Philip's voice cracked. I'm sorry. She paused, looking back once. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Just clarity. I know, she said. Then she walked out into the Manhattan afternoon, where Jonathan Harrington waited beside a town car. "Where to, Ms. Corral?" he asked. Catherine looked up at the skyline. The city Philip had once promised to conquer, the world he'd believed was his. "Home," she said. Not the estate in Illinois, not the penthouse she'd inherited, but wherever she decided to build next. On her own terms, with her own power. Finally completely free.